Thank you for joining us for the next installment in our Sport Management and Mental Health Week. Happy to be joined by AJ Cossell, a clinical educator here at Wichita State University in the Department of Human Performance Studies. Welcome, AJ. Thank you for taking the time.
Of course. Happy to do it.
If you could maybe just talk a little bit about, I know you're fairly new and recent to WSU professionally. So if you could just talk a little bit about your professional journey up to this point to just kind of give a little context for some of the listeners.
Sure. I was raised out in Southwest Kansas, really tiny town of like 800. And so I had the ability to play a bunch of different sports and have a wide variety there. I ended up going to Friends University to play volleyball. I played volleyball all 4 years there. Was really grateful for that opportunity, but I was definitely a player that probably had more raw athletic ability and less skill because I had come from a background that was very multi-sport, right? I didn't have a ton of training in just volleyball. And so for me, strength and conditioning was really crucial to my development as an athlete and something I fell in love with really early. I loved being in the weight room. I loved that I felt like I had control over my athletic ability in that way. And I really loved the science behind it at the same time. And so that's kind of where I started to fall in love with exercise science and human performance. I also loved training my fellow teammates. I stayed on as an assistant volleyball coach after and had the ability to kind of also be strength and conditioning coach for the team at that point. And in an effort to pursue collegiate strength and conditioning, came to Wichita State to get my master's in human performance studies. I started working under Dr. Heidi Bell as a teaching assistant and research assistant. And that's where I discovered I really like to teach. So during that time, I started to work for Orange Theory Fitness and started to train more general population. Really enjoyed that, worked for Orange Theory Fitness for 6 years. Grew in the company, had the ability to also not just focus on the performance side of the business and the fitness side of the business, but business operations as well, which I really loved that combination. But got a little burnout on the sales side of the business and the fitness industry in general, and loved teaching enough that when there was an opportunity for me to come back to Wichita State, it was a good fit.
Wonderful. All right. So you talked a little bit about some of the positive experiences associated with being a student athlete. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the challenges or some of the negatives, quote unquote, that you had to navigate or manage as a student athlete?
Mm-hmm. I think strong athletes tend to be high performers, and they're often not just high performers in one area. And that was me for sure. I wanted to perform at my absolute best on the court, but I also felt that same pressure to perform at my absolute best in the classroom. And so I held myself to a standard and kept a 4.0 GPA. And I was trying to plan for career possibilities. And so I was probably working, 10 to 20 hours a week at my on-campus jobs at the same time. So I think it's common that athletes not only want to excel in one area of their sport, but also feel that same pressure to excel everywhere else. And so, especially during my time in college, and I think this probably started in high school some as well, but a lot of performance anxiety with that much pressure to perform in not just one area, but all of them, and kind of keep all of the balls in the air at the same time was a lot. And so performance anxiety was something I really experienced a lot of during that time throughout college. Time management was really hard to go along with all of that. And then one challenge, especially as an athlete, that I struggled with a lot was the expectations that were put on my physical body to either look a certain way in a uniform or to maintain a certain size in order to perform well. And the feeling that if I lost control of that, then I would lose control of my performance or my appearance at the same time. So those were probably some of the toughest parts.
Okay. And this is a nice little segue. So if you're kind of transporting yourself back to when you were immersed as a student athlete, what did the general phrase, quote unquote, mental health mean to you at that time? And then we'll follow that up with, has that changed between now and then, the differences between that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and I was a student athlete about 7 to 10 years ago. So some time, but not an incredibly long amount of time. I think for us, mental health was something that was talked about, but it was talked about in such a general way
Yeah.
of don't forget about your mental health. And that's kind of as far as that conversation went. I don't really feel like we weren't talked about exactly what mental health meant. We weren't talked about tools that we could have used. I really wasn't aware that my disordered eating or exercise habits were a problem until after I got out of college, because so many of us were doing it that it was just normal. And so we didn't think that, we didn't realize that anything around exercise or nutrition that we were doing wasn't helpful or wasn't supportive of our mental health, because that conversation was just never had. So I think it was rather vague, and it was kind of an area that everybody wanted to leave up to somebody else to talk about, of let's let the counselors talk about that problem. As coaches, I know that can be a scary world to step into and start talking to your athletes about, or let's let the athletic trainers talk to them if their weight is decreasing or things like that. So it kind of felt like a hot potato that nobody really wanted to handle.
Interesting. So, and just kind of a follow-up question. So you talked about, you and some of your teammates or student athlete colleagues at the time, it took sort of a change in context from being a student athlete immersed in the actual activity to then see that maybe there were some things that were out of alignment. Can you sort of recall what were some of those, like, when did you start to notice that maybe there was a difference between then and that now piece where maybe things didn't line up?
I think when I had more education around nutritional habits, I started realizing, like, oh, that 3-week soup cleanse that I went on, or like the 3-day just drinking water and lemon and cayenne pepper, like absolutely made no sense. But at that point, like, that was all the education and tools we had, whereas a lot of stuff we were getting off of social media, which is, you have no point of credibility, or like no concept of credibility at that point. Don't think we had any educational content around nutrition. I knew from my classes that me and my teammates were at a higher risk of eating disorders, but nobody was talking about that within our realm of athletics. And also, once I was done being a student athlete, I started therapy, and that introspective process was helpful to start to see a lot of that as well.
Okay. So you mentioned some things that I find really interesting. And one was, of course, the education piece. Do like to hear that. But also you talked about almost like the hot potato topic where nobody really wanted the accountability aspect. And then relatedly, the infrastructure within, for example, intercollegiate athletics has changed quite a bit. We have, embedded counselors and things like that in many athletic departments. And there's been obviously a change in the vocabulary around mental health within intercollegiate athletics. Relatedly, sport managers, so kind of tying it into who we are and what we do. Sport managers oftentimes are tasked with creating the spaces and the places for student athletes, whether it's in an athletic department, even for those that, kind of wanted to go into coaching or things like that, but, creating that atmosphere on campus. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about one to two tools, to kind of use one of your words you talked about earlier. What are 1 to 2 tools that would be useful for sport managers to know about student athletes and mental health so that we can continue to ensure their success?
I think one area that can be really tricky and kind of lends that hot potato problem is like the world of nutrition and body composition. Those are hard conversations to have, because well, there's 2 different ends of the spectrum that we need to consider, right? And so you often find people that are either on the end of the spectrum of body composition is necessary for sport. And so, which is true, like sport is a game of physics at some point. And so body composition changes will affect athletic performance, right? And so let's weigh our athletes once a month. And if my athlete's weight is increasing or their body fat percentage is increasing, then we need to have a conversation with them about that, right? Because at that point, their body composition is boiled down to their athletic performance. Or on the other side of the spectrum, we may realize that those types of conversations can increase the risk of eating disorders or disordered eating habits or exercise habits. And so let's not talk about nutrition at all. Let's not talk about carbs or fats or proteins at all. And so I think what needs to happen is that we have to find a third way where we're discussing the scientific principles of nutrition with a lens that is trauma informed and informed around mental health disorders and where those affect athletes the most. So it's not just having a nutritionist come in, and it may not just be having a therapist come in. It's potentially a nutritionist who is well versed in the world of eating disorders and is able to talk about both ends of those spectrums rather than one versus the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm hearing kind of a holistic approach, right? We talk about that in the world of business, where the leader is engaging each individual employee as a sort of totality of who they are. And it seems like there might be some utility in terms of the coach, but then also the athletic infrastructure that surrounds a student athlete, not just boiling them down to performance metrics or height, weight, those types of things, but maybe trying to help, again, going back to one of your words, educate the entire person, which I think kind of brings me to maybe my last point is just moving forward. So in the 7 to 10 years since you were a student athlete, moving forward for the next 7 to 10 years, what would be some additional mental health challenges that you think student athletes are going to have to either face or continue to face moving forward?
I think the immense amount of pressure around performance is still there, and not just athletic performance or academic performance, but student athletes are also in the phase of life where they're exploring dating for the first time, and they're with NIL, are more engaged on social media, and pressures for performance in all of those different areas. I've seen, even with student athletes that I have the privilege to educate in my classroom, like they just stack and stack and stack and stack. And potentially, I think we also have to consider, like, what's the goal? Is the goal for these students just to be able to perform at their absolute best athletic level or academic level during these 4 years? Or is the goal to form them holistically as the type of people that we want to see out in the world, and using athletics and academics as a way to carve or build that person and allow them to figure that out for themselves? If I'm a coach of a team, I would rather have one athlete perform a little bit more poor on the field and have a healthier outlook on their performance and their worth as a human after graduation, rather than just what I can squeeze out of them in that 4 years. So I think it's like a reconsidering of what the actual goal is. And sometimes, like, having to take that away, like, maybe the actual goal isn't the conference championship. Like, but I also know in the world of like athletics and academics, letting go of that highest achiever award is really challenging. But I think we just have to consider what type of people we're building for after they graduate.
I think that's a great point. So you're talking about, helping the individuals at the most micro of levels to grow, evolve, and be the best version of themselves. The organization or the meso level is actively involved in that. But then at the macro level, culturally, the onus is also going to be on us as consumers of intercollegiate athletics to help redefine, the purpose, the function, and then maybe the coaching staff that does a wonderful job of educating, supporting, and, growing productive members of society. maybe we don't then judge them on wins and losses, kind of a thing. So sounds like we've got, I mean, obviously we can't eat the elephant in one bite here. So we have a lot to work on, but I greatly appreciate you taking the time. I know you're super busy and you have a lot of things going on, especially this time of the semester, but is there anything else that you would like the listeners to know about who you are, what you do, or maybe this concept of mental health as it pertains to intercollegiate athletics?
I think a lot of this conversation has been around like the challenges that I saw as a student athlete and the things that are still present. And I would also say, to add to that conversation, is that my time as a student athlete, whether it be in college or in high school, formed me probably in a better way than maybe any other experience that I had. I would not know how to be a leader without the 4 years that I spent in collegiate athletics. I would not know how to rally a group of people around a common idea. I would not know how to motivate. I would not know how to inspire. I would not know how to be calm in a moment of chaos. Like, I would not have learned those things, and I would not have built the relationships that I built if I did not have that piece. So does being a student athlete come with its challenges, and are there parts of the system that we still need to work on? Absolutely. But I also think that there are key lessons that I couldn't have got without that experience either.
Fantastic. All the more reason to make sure that we are supporting individuals throughout the entire process, really help to maximize, the interpersonal, the professional skill development that really comes from participation in some of these sporting activities. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to either reach out to AJ or myself directly, and we'll happy to have the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.